Welcome to Prepared for Parenthood, the podcast for hopeful, expectant, and new parents with little ones up to age 5. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Duger, a psychotherapist, author, educator, parent coach, and married mother of 2. On this show, we'll discuss everything from the most up-to-date practicals of best supporting your young children, to thriving in relationship as a family, to more surprising topics around the psychology and development of babies from conception through age 5. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm thrilled to have you here today. Welcome to Prepared for Parenthood. I'm thrilled today to have our guest, Dr. Thomas Verny, who is a psychiatrist, academic, award-winning author, poet, global speaker, blogger on Psychology Today, and columnist for The Globe and Mail. He's the author of 8 books, including the international bestseller, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, which has been published in 27 countries. That's amazing, 27 countries. And he's also author of The Embodied Mind, Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies. Today, that's been published in Spanish, Greek, Russian, Portuguese, and Czech. He's also the author of 47 scientific papers. Dr. Verny has previously taught at Harvard University, University of Toronto, York University, Toronto, St. Mary's University, Minneapolis, and the Santa Barbara Graduate Institute. In 2004, Mothering Magazine, in recognition of his contributions in the field of parenting and child rearing, named Dr. Verny one of their living treasures. In 2005, Santa Barbara Graduate Institute bestowed on him the Doctorate of Humane Mothers. Dr. Verny founded the Association of Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health, and I had the great pleasure of working with him for 6 years on APPPAH's scientific journal, JOPA. So welcome. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here too.
So there's so many different questions that I could ask you, and I really want to focus today on how you came to understand that babies in utero and at birth are actually having remembered lived experience and are not just blank slates as we used to think in psychology. How did you kind of stumble into this arena and start working with this?
Yes, stumble is a good word. Stumble is a good word. What happened, what sort of started me off on this track was an experience with a patient. As you said, I'm a psychiatrist, and I worked with my patients. Usually I focused a lot on their dreams. And so one day I was working with a young man, and while we were working on his dream, he suddenly started crying like a little baby. And he did that for 10 minutes approximately. Then he came out of it. And so I asked him, what happened? And he said he had just found himself crying in this crib. I was crying for my mother. And then he said, being a somewhat skeptical young lawyer, he said, there's something wrong with this picture because I've actually seen photographs of myself as a baby, and they were all taken in a blue crib. And the crib that I just found myself in right now was white. So it doesn't quite make sense. So I suggested that he speak to his mother. He was a young man. He still had his parents alive. So next week he came back and I asked him what happened. And he said, this is amazing. What happened was that when I was born, my parents were very poor. They could not afford to buy me a crib. And so they borrowed a crib from a neighbor. And that crib was white. And only 3 months later, did they have somehow enough money. They bought me my very own crib, and that was blue. And that's the one that all the photographs were taken in. So I sort of scratched my head about that. That was the very first time I've heard anything like that in my life. And I was pretty well educated, as you have implied, some of the best schools in North America. And I was always taught that children before the age of 2 can't remember anything. So I sort of put it on the back shelf of my mind. And then a couple of months later, I heard this interview on the radio with one of the best known conductors in Canada. And towards the end of the interview, I guess the interviewer kind of ran out of things to ask. And so she said, "Tell me, Boris, how did you get into conducting?" And he said, "It started in my mother's womb." Well, everybody sat up. Nobody had heard that before. And they said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, when I first started conducting, some of the lines of the cello kind of jumped out at me. Before I even changed the page, I knew what was coming, although I had never studied that particular score." So then I went home to my mother once again, the well of all good news, and he asked her about that. And she said, "Well, what is the score that seems so familiar to you?" And he told her what it was. She was a cello player. And she said, "Those were the very melodies that I used to practice when I was pregnant with you."
Mhm.
So, I started thinking about that. And then I had more and more sort of similar experiences because I guess my ear was tuned into that kind of a thing. And for example, a friend of mine sang a certain song to her unborn child, but she said after the child was born and he started crying, I tried to sing all kinds of other songs to him, but the only song that really settled him was the one that I used to sing when he was pregnant. So that was sort of enough to make me think. And so I started doing research and I found a few research articles in scientific journals that seem to support the possibility that an unborn child may be laying down memories. And so again, serendipity. I had dinner with an obstetrician, very well-known obstetricians in Canada at that time. I was like a totally unknown young psychiatrist. And I told him about these experiences that I had been accumulating. And he said, "Well, in 2 months, there's this huge congress. It meets every 4 years on psychosomatic obstetrics and gynecology in Rome. Why don't you submit a paper?" Well, I mean, I was a young beginning psychiatrist, but I knew enough to know when you're a presenter, you get treated much better than an ordinary member of the
Mhm.
audience. So why not? So I submitted this paper and I called it The Psychic Life of the Unborn Child. And lo and behold, it was accepted. And not only was it accepted, but it was put on the best morning schedule where people like R.D. Lang were going to speak. And the best known people at that time in the psychosomatic obstetrics and gynecology were slated to speak. And I had 20 minutes with all those leading lights. And so when I spoke and related some of my experiences, like two of them, which I've just told you, and more, I could sense kind of electricity running through the audience. And I could feel their energy coming. This is, I guess, what actors talk about, why they like acting on stage instead of performing in movies, because you get that back and forth. And so I said at the end of my 20 minutes, if anybody here would like to continue a conversation about this, please come to my room at 5 o'clock. Well, at 5 o'clock, there was this lineup of people trying to get into my room. Ronnie Lang was there and, all the other ones that I have forgotten the names right now. And we talked and I made contact with these people and they were all very supportive and enthusiastic. And so when I came back to Canada, I started writing about how this is possible in terms of biology. How is this possible? Because we were taught that for example, the large nerve tracts are not yet myelinated before the age of 5, and things of that nature. And so I started to find supportive evidence. And then I wrote an outline of this book. And to make matters a little shorter, it was accepted by Simon and Schuster, which is a huge publisher. They changed the title because psychic sounded too far away, California. So they changed it to The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And that was 1980 in Los Angeles. I met David Chamberlain. And so I spoke to him, and the two of us really got along very well. And then I started writing to him saying, why don't we make a presentation at the annual meeting of the American Psychological Association? And we submitted a paper, but it was rejected because at that time, nobody believed in any of this. And so I said, rather unwisely, why don't we form our own association? And David said, sure, if you arrange it, we'll do it. And so that was the birth of.
And what happened with APPAH?
Well, what happened with APPAH is that with no money at all, with my secretary and a few people who I gathered around me in Toronto, Canada, we arranged the first International Congress on Pre and Perinatal Psychology, PRE. And everybody who was anybody, like David Cheek and hundreds of people from all over the world were invited, and they came. And so it was an incredible Congress. We had something like 400 to 500 people. So at the end of the Congress, David Chamberlain and I and few of the other stalwarts got together, and we formed the Pre and Perinatal Psychology of North America, PANA. I was elected as the first president. David Chamberlain and my wife, Sandra Collier, were vice presidents, and then other positions were taken by other people. And that's how it all started 40 years ago.
And it's turned into APPAH.
Yes.
And is still going strong.
Yes. We had our 40th anniversary meeting in Denver last fall. And the association journal I started 2 years later. And that has been going strong, and it's getting better every year.
So
Sure.
What did you discover about how is it actually possible for babies to remember their time in utero and their births?
Well, that has always been the principal question, really. How is it possible? So at the time that I wrote The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, we had enough biological, scientific evidence from well-researched places, some of the best universities, to show by the end of the second trimester, in other words, about 6 months after conception, the unborn child had all the neurological neurons and cellular capacity to lay down memories. And so one could easily prove, for example, that a myelination, although it was correctly thought to only finish at about 5 years, was not necessary for nerve conduction. It only increased the speed of nerve conduction. So even without myelin, and especially in a very, very small body, those unborn children were receiving signals almost instantly. And many other biological research showed that it is possible to lay down memories between 6 and 9 months. So that really was proven beyond a shadow of doubt, really. I was very satisfied with that. What I was not satisfied with, that there were children's memories which seemed to be intact, which seemed to be supported by reports from other people, which went beyond, in other words, backwards in time, even to conception. And so there was nothing that I could find over the years until about 9 years ago, let's say a decade ago, 2014, that could show how this is possible biologically. Then I read in one of the scientific journals about a 44-year-old Frenchman who went to see his GP because he had a weakness in his left leg. And they did all kinds of studies on him. They did x-rays of his skull. And to their amazement, they found that he had virtually no brain. He had a thin crescent of brain tissue, and the rest was water, which is called hydrocephalus, water on the brain. Now, this man was employed in the French civil service. He was the father of 2 children. And for all intents and purposes, except for this weakness in his left leg, he was fine. So kind of a light bulb went on in my head. And I thought, how is this possible? So then I started once again looking to see whether there was any scientific evidence to support that. And I found actually that there were descriptions of many operations when young children or adults had epilepsy, which would not leave them. Like there's a kind of epilepsy which sometimes hits you 5, 6 times a day instead of just, once in 3 months or whatever. And so the only treatment for that would be to take out that part of the brain which was causing the epileptic seizures. And sometimes doctors took out half the brain. And yet, not all, but many of the children and many of the adults who had this major operation continued to act and think and behave totally naturally. So then I started to think that there must be some other way in which we remember what happened in addition to the brain. I mean, obviously the brain is very important. And so I started thinking along the lines that the rest of our body below the neck, so to speak, is acting like a backup system, which perhaps, we have in our computers, so that if something goes wrong with the computer, you can still find all the information and you back up this. And so I started to look into the possibility of cellular memory. And that's it took 7 years because it was very hard slogging. And I had to get into genetics, which I really didn't know very much about, and quantum mechanics and all kinds of other things that really I didn't know or knew very little about, and put it all together. And that's when I wrote The Embodied Mind, which essentially says that, yes, the brain is very important, but also we are connected to the rest of our bodies, and memory is a network. It's like WWW, Worldwide Network, except that it's in your own system. And that actually goes very well, our modern way of thinking about computers and computing, because it's not sort of the individual cell, but it's all of them being connected that really makes the difference. So that's where I am at the moment.
And so for a little human coming into the world, they're gestating in the pregnant parent's body. Are they just getting information from the gestating parent, or are they getting information from the outside world? And how is that getting laid down? It ends up in
Yeah.
their
Well,
spleen, in their lungs. What does that look like?
Well, they get their information, first of all, directly by listening. Okay. For a long time, it was thought that children, because as you well know, they are in the amniotic sac, so that they're surrounded by water, the amniotic fluid, and then the muscles of the mother, the abdomen. So it was thought that children couldn't hear anything inside the womb. But this has been proven totally wrong many, many years ago. But the problem is academics and scientists and doctors is that they kind of stick to what they learned at university. So even 20, 30 years later, any new information is kind of resistant. Once you learn, like I did, for example, that children before the age can learn anything, that's what you believe in. And no matter what other information comes in, you kind of resist it. So yes, the unborn child inside the mother's abdomen can hear better than it can actually hear outside, because water actually increases conduction rather than decreasing it. So again, kind of a false idea that scientists held for many, many years. So the baby in utero listens to the maternal heartbeat. It listens to the gastrointestinal noises as she eats, and it can hear sounds outside. And research has been done on this. And you can put a microphone inside the womb, let's say, of a sheep, and you can hear sounds outside quite well. Not perfectly, but quite. The other way in which the baby receives information is through placenta and the circulation between the mother that goes through the placenta into the umbilicus of the child. So all the hormones, for example, all the stress hormones will be passing into the baby from the mother. The baby receives all those signals that you and I would receive from our bodies. When we are under stress, our heart might beat a little bit faster, our blood pressure may go up, things of that nature. So all those signals that the body interprets as stress, for example, the baby's body interprets as stress too. So it's a combination of all those things, not one particular. The other thing that the unborn child receives is it receives strong emotions. So the unborn child can differentiate between love and hate, between very strong emotions. So if a mother talks, for example, in a loving way to her unborn child, that baby is on some level able to receive that as a positive energizer of his or her system. If, on the other hand, the mother wants to abort the baby and has very negative feelings about the baby will receive that too. And if that child whose mother wanted to abort him is born, he or she is going to have psychological difficulties because on an unconscious level, they will carry that message forever in their unconscious. So let me tell you a little story. I was interviewed by a journalist the other day, and she said, when I had my first pregnancy, my husband was an intern in a hospital, and he was hardly ever home. The second pregnancy, 4 years later, he was home a lot because I guess he graduated, and he would talk to my baby every night. And I said, well, what would he say? And she said, well, we had dinner. It's a nice day. And we are going to listen now to some music. And you go to sleep and see you tomorrow. Something like that. Well, when this baby was born, the second child, my husband walked in and he came over to me. The baby was lying on my breast. And he said, hi, Junior. And the baby just looked at him and gave him this beautiful smile of recognition. And there was no doubt in anybody's mind that baby recognized my husband's voice. And P.S., the relationship between my firstborn and my husband and my secondborn and my husband, very different. My secondborn, who prenatally bonded with my husband, has got a so much better relationship. So children do learn in the womb about their parents, about the outside world, and connecting with them, bonding with them, talking to them, playing with them. All those things are very important.
That's fascinating. And so I've had the experience myself with my own two children up until about the age of 2.5. They could remember a lot about their time in the womb,
Really.
and about their births. So they would come and spontaneously share information that we had never intentionally shared with them at all
Can
about
you give me
things
an
that had
example?
happened.
Can you give me an
So,
example?
so for example, our firstborn, I had a lot of nausea during that pregnancy. And so I would eat a lot of mint, including things like mint chocolate chip ice cream, which wasn't the best choice, but it tasted good. And afterwards, I stopped eating. The nausea was gone once it was gone. And this was obviously in the first trimester. And she was about a year and 3/4. And we were out in the garden and we had mint growing in the garden. And she said, Mommy, you used to eat a lot of, in her 1.5-year-old voice, you used to eat a lot of mint chocolate chip ice cream when I was in your tummy. And I was like, what? How, how did you know that? And she's like, oh, I loved mint chocolate chip ice cream. She loved the taste of it. And we had never even given her ice cream. She'd never had ice cream. We didn't eat a lot of mint in our house. She had that taste of the mint from the garden, and it
Amazing.
brought her back. And it
Yeah.
was, obviously I've been studying this for a long time
Yeah.
as an adult, and it was so beautiful just to hear her experience and have my mind blown open, of course.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in your work, is there a time it seemed like once my children got to about 2.5 years old, they kind of lost that ability to share. That
Yeah.
part of the memory shut down.
Uh,
Does that
Absolutely. Absolutely. The best time to talk to children about their pre-birth memories or birth is somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5. Yours started really early, 1.5. Yeah,
Mm.
it's very unusual. Was she very verbal already, very early?
Yes, both of our children were very verbal.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
that makes a difference. But, that was one of the things that really, again, sort of convinced me of the reality of prenatal memories was a psychologist from Seattle, I think, who wrote me that when she was bathing her child about 1.5 or 2 years old, she just for no reason at all, asked her, do you remember anything about your birth? And this little child started telling her everything about the birth. And what was it like before you were born? Well, it was very dark, and I was lying on a mat over water or something like that. So she's talking about the placenta and the amniotic universe and things like that. So a lot of people have that experience. And when I talk about these things, I often ask people in the audience whether they have any children who are very young and to try to talk to them, particularly in the evening and bath times when they're very relaxed. But yours is unusual because your daughter was just the signal in the garden, I guess, the mint
Mhm.
gave her sort of an entry into her past.
Yeah, like a little flashback for her.
Yeah,
Be
yeah,
amazing.
it is
And,
amazing.
and is there anything that we can share with expectant parents? I think a lot of people, once they hear this information, they maybe become concerned, like,
Yes,
oh, everything that I do and say and every stress that I have is impacting my
right.
baby. And
Good.
what if my birth is a stressful experience and all
Yeah,
that? How can we help
sure,
those parents?
sure, sure. Well, one of the things that one can emphasize, parents sometimes argue. It's difficult not to over 9 months. um, so what I suggest that when they argue and they have finished arguing, to explain to the child that this was not about the child. This was not about you. This is what parents sometimes do. They don't agree about certain things, but both of us, and hopefully the father and the mother can say this, both of us really love you. We look forward to seeing you. Talking about other stressful situations to the baby, I think, is also helpful. It makes everybody feel better, and I think it helps. Also, don't worry about small stresses, like running after a streetcar is not going to be a black mark on your child's brain forever. It's the chronic, continuous stress. If, for example, a mother is a single mother and she doesn't know whether perhaps she should keep the child or not, perhaps she's in a very difficult financial situation. If all those kinds of things impact your mind, then that is dangerous for the child. Okay. So that would be a situation that should be avoided at all costs. It's the chronic stress or a sudden, very acute stress. For example, if you should find out that your husband has lost his job, this could be very stressful. And again, remember that, there's two of you there. and talked to the child about that. And yes, I'm upset because daddy lost his job, but we'll get out of this. We'll be okay. I got upset when I heard it, but it will be okay. So talking to the baby is important. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for the unavoidable stresses,
Yes.
like a partner losing a job, a stressful experience at birth, when do you think is the best time for parents to try to repair an unavoidable stressor or situation, something that didn't go well for both themselves and for that baby?
Okay. I'll tell you a story very briefly. One day, a woman came to me who had read my Secret Life of the Unborn Child, and she said, my daughter and I have always been, well, it was a loving relationship, but it is a loving relationship. She's 12 years old. But, it has never been fully loving. And so I asked her a little bit about her pregnancy. And she said, well, when my daughter was born, she looked angry. And I noticed that. And I said to everybody present, obstetrician nurses, look at her. She looks angry. Why do you think she's angry? And of course, everybody just laughed and said, oh, children have no feelings. She's probably just hungry or something like that. So I said to the woman, well, why don't you go home and talk to your daughter who's 12 years old about that? So next week she came back and she said, I talked to my daughter and I said to her, when you were born, you looked angry. Were you angry? And the daughter said, yes, I was. And the mother said, why? And the daughter said, because you wanted a boy. And my patient, the mother said, that's true. That's true. I have no idea why. But all throughout the pregnancy, I was thinking, please God, let it be a boy. And then when my daughter was born, I fell in love with her. I cherished her. I loved her. But she's right. I wanted a boy. So I admitted that, she said. I said, yes, you're right. I'm sorry. They both cried. I cried when I heard it. And our relationship has been totally repaired. We had what we had never had before. We are really close now. So I think that, any time when you think that you want to talk about this and you think that your daughter or son is ready to hear it, I don't think that there's a particular time. Like, for example, in the example that you have just said about your daughter, 1.5 years old, I would not expect a 1.5-year-old, statistically speaking, to be able to describe her memories as well as your daughter did. So, there are big differences, but parents know their child well. And whenever they think it's right, it's right.
And it sounds like there's a piece too, Dr. Verny, about honesty in
Yes,
there. So,
absolutely.
if things did not go well, or if you had a gender preference and you were sharing that throughout the pregnancy, I hope it's a boy or I hope it's a girl, to be honest and to have humility around that seems like it's very reparative for those babies and for
It's
the relationship.
Speaking of relationships, I think it's very, very important to be honest in all relationships. And that includes your relationship with your child.
Is there a way to be too honest? For example, if there was the experience of a parent who actually wasn't ready, wasn't prepared to have a child, wasn't expecting to have a child, suddenly is pregnant, and they are considering not
Okay.
keeping this child.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. And I think that, yes, even then, you should be honest, admit that you feel terrible, just like my patient did. You feel terrible. It's insane. Or under the circumstances, the one that you have just suggested, it was perfectly normal for the mother to weigh the possibilities. I didn't want to have a child and not be able to give it my full attention or to financially support her. I had some real misgivings about going through with this pregnancy. You explain it, you say how you feel, and that should do it.
And I'm always so relieved every time I see a parent-child relationship heal
Yes.
after a challenging experience, either during pregnancy or getting pregnant
Yes.
or a hard birth or a hard postpartum. And just, I think, for parents to know that there, of course, are ways to support the whole family in healing from this so that you can move on and have a positive, healthy relationship with each other for the
Right.
rest of your lives is so
Absolutely.
encouraging.
Yes. Yes, it is. It is. But like I said, it applies to all relationships with your husband, with your friends. Really, the best thing is to be honest.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Verny, for being here. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Take care and good
Uh,
luck with your book,
Thank
Preparing
you
for
so
Parenthood.
much.
Take
Thank
care.
you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good luck.
Thank you so much for listening to the Prepared for Parenthood podcast today. I hope you found this episode educational, informational, and conversational, and that you'll join me again for another episode soon. If you enjoyed listening to today's podcast, I'd very much appreciate if you would rate, review, and subscribe. If you're interested in more information related to today's podcast, or are looking for parent coaching or courses, you can find my information in the show notes or online at preparedforparenthood.com.